Possessor is an original film written and directed by Brandon Cronenberg, the son of David Cronenberg. This is his second film to date, and he made a sci-fi psychological horror thriller. At least that's what it's labeled as, and I'm going to get back to that in just a bit. But first of all, let's go over the plot. So we follow a trained assassin named Possessor, played by Andrea Riseborough, who uses a unique technology to enter the minds of specific hosts and controls their bodies to carry out her hits. And after every hit, she gets her psychological stability tested by her boss, Gerder, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh. And her next mission is to kill a wealthy CEO, played by Sean Bean, by possessing the fiancé of his daughter, Colin, played by Christopher Abbott. The mission is carried out, but something goes awry, which leads to the third act being about a struggle of wills. So I mean, right off the bat, the concept is reminiscent of such films as Inception, The Cell, and to a lesser degree, Upgrade. So even though the concept itself is not that unique, it's the way that Brandon Cronenberg shoots it is what makes the film so unique. There's some really cool techniques used here to show this sort of mind meld that goes on between the characters. Yes, mind meld, kind of sort of like Star Trek, except this is more of a mind melt, as you see this really cool effect that harkens back to Raiders of the Lost Ark. And there's some cool usage of like what looks like slides, or even like the idea of like projectors and machines not working quite right, as well as having a lot of lens flares to show the transitions. So there's a lot of really cool visuals utilized here in order to demonstrate that psychological bond. In fact, there's one really cool scene where a character is helping Voss get out of a host's body, and every time he clicks a switch, it goes between reality and inside her mind. It switches between bodies as well as the lighting. But it's the exact same geography, so it just makes for a really cool effect. Very creepy. So I wouldn't really label this as a horror by any means. It is psychological, and I would say it's a thriller, but the thing is, I mean, there's nothing scary about the film. You could say there's some horrific imagery in it, but it's kind of the same vein of having a really gory action film. You wouldn't really call that horror, you would just call that high violence, which the film is pretty violent. You're going to have a lot of skin piercing and blood loss and a couple of other disgusting shots. And on top of that, there's a surprising amount of nudity in the film. Between the violence and the nudity, I felt like both were kind of unnecessary to tell the story, especially since it's about two characters and their minds battling for wills. So I didn't really see the point in a lot of gratuitous imagery. It just felt a little bit like shock value rather than having a purpose. But speaking of purpose, I was trying to figure out what the takeaway of this film was. And I mean, the final shot of the film, I think, kind of staples that there's sort of this nihilistic viewpoint. If you're looking for character development or character growth, this is not the movie for you. Unfortunately, this movie is really all about carrying out this one concept, and it does it with flying colors in the visual department. Despite the fact that we're inside the mind of two different characters that are melding together, we really don't know that much about each person. At least in the sense of like their motivations, their wants, their desires, or seeing them change. The only thing we know is that Colin is engaged and works a job, and that he probably feels emasculated, which is told to us, not shown. And Voss has a family that she sometimes feels a little detached from. And that's about all we get. And so for the rest of the movie, it's very clear that the direction is trying to show a very like unstable, sort of like off-kilter type style. We have different shots used here, like, you know, these slow zooms, these rotating Dutch angles, and going handheld. But for some reason, and this bugged me throughout the entire film, there's this thing called the rule of thirds when you're framing up shots. The idea is that you don't want things to be necessarily dead center or off to the side too much. You use these lines as a means of lining up pictures so that they look more cinematic. And for the most part, Brandon follows these rules, but for some reason he's got this very common medium close-up that always has the character off to what feels like the wrong side. Usually when you have a shot like this, you have a character who's looking one way and leaning the opposite direction of that frame. And for some reason, it's perplexingly switched here. Whichever direction the character is looking is now where they're leaning towards, which makes for a lot of negative space within the shot. Really, negative space just doesn't really mean anything. It just means there's a lot of space not being used. It gets to the point where characters are just sort of cut out of frame partially. Initially, I thought maybe this had something to do with trying to go for that off-kilter kind of feel, like, you know, these characters are unstable, but he uses it even during other moments, and it was even kind of inconsistent. I mean, here's an example of having a framed up shot, but then he just goes back and forth of having these sort of empty looking shots. And I thought, okay, well, I kind of got this sort of hollow feeling out of the story. Maybe that's what he's trying to go for, you know, with all that empty space. Kind of a stretch, but that's the closest I can get to it. Otherwise, I just gotta be honest, these shots look really amateur to me. Now, this is Brandon's second feature film, so I wouldn't be surprised if this is sort of him coming into his own. Because there were moments, too, where I think the lighting was supposed to imitate night or even sunrise, and it just looked like the wrong color. It was too intense. So I couldn't help but feel like there were some odd choices here. But on the flip side, though, there were some really unique visuals in these sequences, And whenever he did a profile shot, it was framed up really well. As far as the music goes, it has this sort of generic dramatic synth type music, but I feel like it's used effectively to show us how a character is inside their own head and not quite in the present moment. It also gives us the idea that time is sort of passing by for this character. So I feel like that was applied here very effectively too. And again, I think with a sort of a hollow storyline, I didn't really feel for the characters or anything that was going on necessarily. I thought the violence and the nudity was overkill, but like I said, I thought the visuals were fantastic, and I think it's the one thing that's memorable about this film. Possession gets my rating of 2.5 stars. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Have you all seen Possession? If not, what else have you been watching lately? Comment below, let me know, and of course stay tuned if you all want to see more.